Okay, we're good to go, Teresa.
All right, well, we're expecting a lot of folks online today. I apologize that my camera is not working. I'm not sure. I moved back from the office back to home and now my camera's not working. But my name is Teresa Holt. I'm State Director of AARP Alaska. I want to welcome you to this first of our gardening series. We're very excited. Lots of people are both listening on Facebook and here on the webinar. If you would like to ask a question today, please look in the chat. I've put my email in the chat. It's THOLT@AARP, and that's how we're going to be able to manage all the questions today. I'd like to introduce Nadine Lefevre, who is a volunteer for AARP, and she's going to introduce our speaker. Go ahead, Nadine.
Hey, thank you and welcome everyone. Glenna Gannon is an assistant professor of sustainable food systems at the University of Alaska Institute of Agriculture, Natural Resources and Extension, and was recently elected to the governing board of the Alaska Food Policy Council. Over the past 10 years, she has taught the Alaska Grower School and the workshops that teach gardening, food preservation, and safety skills for the federally recognized Tribes Extension Program. Glenna has a Master's of Environmental and Sustainability Science from the University of Saskatchewan and has taken advanced courses in agriculture science from Oregon State University. Welcome, Glenna. Thank you for presenting today.
Thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you to everyone who has joined on a sunny spring day to hang out with me and talk about starting seeds. So yeah, that is the topic of today. We're talking about how to get a jump start on our short and relatively cool Alaska growing season. So I'm going to go over some seed basics with you guys. Just so you know, you're actually joining me from the research head house and greenhouse at the Agriculture and Forestry Experiment Station. So we have this wonderful facility to work in today. And if we have time, maybe we'll take a spin around the greenhouse facility as well. So just a little bit of notes before we get started. I shared a couple of handouts that Teresa or Daryl should have shared with you. These are the Cooperative Extension publications, or one is the Cooperative Extension publication on seed starting and transplanting, which just covers the basics of what we'll be going over today. So it's a good reference for you. There's also in that document some reference to other publications by Cooperative Extension that you might find useful about things like greenhouse management or the lights that you might need for starting seeds and so on. I've also had them include just a list of notes. You won't be able to see anything I'm holding here, and I don't expect you to, but basically these are sort of my talking points. So it will keep you from necessarily having to write down everything I say. So you kind of have these to follow along with, and you can fill them in on the side or reference them later. So with that, I'm going to get started. And again, I'm going to be going over the basics, but we'll pause every so often so that you have an opportunity to ask me questions. And I don't know if you have the ability to raise your hand in the Zoom application, but if you do, Teresa can pause and ask a question. I really won't be able to see them as I'm talking. So feel free to ask. I don't mind being interrupted. With that, I think what we'll do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of materials that you'll need first, and then we'll actually practice planting a couple seeds. And before that, I'm just going to, oh, you said the chat's disabled. Never mind. All right, I'll choose what we'll start today. But with that, let's kind of get started. So seed starting indoors, why we want to do that, I sort of alluded to this. It's because we have a relatively short growing season in Alaska, as many of you know, and a lot of the crops that we would like to grow take longer than the season that we have. So we can't put them outdoors just yet. So we get them started indoors. There's vegetables and flowers that we want to transplant. Typically, we have about a solid, anywhere in Alaska, we have 80 to 90 frost-free days. Above the Arctic Circle, of course, that changes. And so anything that has a days to maturity that's over about 80 days we would want to start indoors for transplanting later. There are also vegetables and flowers that do better being direct seeded, things like carrots and beets, turnips and peas and beans. They do really well if you just plant them directly into your garden. And there's other things that really do need that start in the warm environment to get started. So things like our cucumbers and our winter squash. And I'm sorry if I'm moving quickly. And so I tried to choose some seed packets that had some photos of what we'll be starting. We'll also be talking a little bit today about onions. So onions are another crop that need a lot of lead time indoors before they're transplanted outside. And before I go on, can I just get a yes from Teresa or Daryl that you can hear me okay? There's a fan in here that.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great, perfect.
And Glenna,
Yes.
Glenna, I'm just going to interrupt real quick. So I put it in the chat, but tomorrow you will receive an email with a link to the recording of this webinar, the PowerPoint, and the handouts that Glenna mentioned.
Great, thank you, Teresa. Yeah, so if you don't have those now, don't panic, you'll get them. And you can always email me. So my email contact information will be included in those documents, and I'm happy to field questions after the presentation or later on down the road when you can't remember something I said, but it's really important for starting those artichokes. All right, so that's kind of the background of why we start seeds, right? And now we're gonna talk a little bit about the materials that you might need. So Alaskans are notoriously creative, and we make things work, right? So what I have before me is sort of what we'd use in a research horticultural environment. However, you're totally able to use reuse pots that you might have got at a nursery some time ago to start your seeds. People even use just old cups. You just want to make sure that you punch holes in the bottom for drainage. People who can use egg cartons, and again, being able to have some drainage, but anything that will hold its shape for about figure 2 months without decomposing or falling apart on you. There's also other things besides cells or transplanting trays that you can use to start seeds in. Some of you may be familiar with soil blocks. It's a handy device that you actually push it into your soil starting medium, pack that material full of the soil, and then you push those soil blocks out into a tray, and it really does just create nice, compact little blocks of soil that, there's different sizes. But then you transplant your seeds directly into those, and you can do away with the plastic or the peat pots or whatever it is you might be using. You see that a lot in production greenhouses for farmers who don't necessarily want to deal with all of the materials, but that's another option for someone who might have a greenhouse or an area where they can kind of make that mess and have those soil bins and trays somewhere where the soil is not going to impact your living room for example. Okay, so I've started to talk a little bit about soil and pots, and so the other important thing to mention is that any pot or cell or cup that you're going to put your transplants in, you want them to be sterilized. Now, this doesn't mean that they have to be sparkling clean and come out of an autoclave. It just means that they need to either be new or soaked in a mild bleach solution for about 30 minutes to kill any pathogens that might cause your seeds to die off. So damping off is a common early seedling disease that will just completely wipe out seedlings, and it makes us all very sad that we've put all our hard work into getting these little babies to grow and then they die for no apparent reason. So a lot of that can be avoided with just making sure you're starting with a clean, sterile pot, as well as your soil. So I have two different soil types here, and it might be kind of hard to see in this, but these are both considered sterile soil. And I'm sorry I don't have the bag here, but I'll just try and show you. So this is a seed starting medium of vermiculite and some sphagnum peat moss, and you can just see it's really fine. And the the thing about seed starting medium like this is it's soilless and it has no nutrients in it. So there's no fertilizer added to this, no compost. It's a sterile medium. This is a mix of sterilized soil. So they look very similar, right? But there's some different ingredients here. So this has a little bit of perlite, that's the bigger white chunks. Again, some sphagnum peat moss, some coconut coir, and then some compost from a local nursery. And when I say sterilize, you can actually sterilize, say, your own home garden soil by baking it in the oven. And Cooperative Extension has some more information about how to go through that process, but you can put it on a cookie sheet and bake it in your oven. Your house will smell like baked soil, not cookies, for a little while, but that will just kill, again, any pathogens that might exist in the soil that could kill off those seedlings. I recommend buying a seed starting medium. I personally, if I'm going to be growing, and I'll talk more about what's going on here in a little bit, but if I'm going to be potting in a larger pot for a larger plant, so these are actually artichokes here, and they'll get quite large before I ever transplant them in the field. Oftentimes I'll use the sterilized soil medium because it means that I won't necessarily disturb those sensitive plants that also grow spines on them to transplant them, but then that also have some nutrients to grow as they're growing from the compost that's in there. Other instances where you might want to not use the soil mix with the compost and just use your vermiculite and seed starting is if you're going to be doing something like this where you're doing a mass start of seeds, and each one of these will actually be, you don't pull them apart, but you kind of roll them to break them apart, and then you transplant each one of these little seedlings into a cell or something like this with more soil. So this is after they have passed the stage, well, these haven't quite. So after they've two true leaves, and again, I'll talk about this in a moment, that's when you would transplant those into larger pots. Okay, so I think that covers soil. Other things that you might need include tags. I know that when we're excited about our seeds, we all think that like, I'll totally remember what this is, or this half of the tray is versus this half. And I can tell you after many years of doing this, I never remember. So I highly recommend a tag and just writing down what it is you're growing to stick it in with your cells. I know some people like to just put the seed packet, put it on a popsicle stick and put that in with their tray. The reason I don't like doing that is if you have any seeds left over, that exposure to moisture will make those, it'll destroy those seeds. And then also, it just might get wet and you might not have that information on hand for later. So just some basic tips. Depending on what kinds of seeds you're starting, you may have to treat them differently prior to being planted. So most garden variety seeds, everything will be starting today. You can just drop it directly into the soil, and I'll demonstrate that in a moment, and that will be fine. However, there are some native species like woody perennials or perennial flowers that they actually need to be treated or stratified with moisture or exposure to cold before they will actually germinate. I'm not going to get too much into that today. If someone has a specific question, I'll answer that. But really, I'm just focusing on garden vegetables and flowers today that you can generally just start directly from seed. So,
Glenna,
yes.
We have two questions about dirt.
Okay.
Can you cook your dirt in the microwave to sterilize it?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't really have a good answer for that. I would recommend doing a Google search and asking soil sterilization. And if you put extension in with your search, you'll actually get results from other cooperative extension, cooperative extensions from the lower 48 and elsewhere that might have evaluated that. I don't necessarily see why not, other than, you know, if there's metals in the soil, you know, like there's minerals and things in the soil that sometimes can react. I don't know, so I don't have a really great answer to that.
So Alex Ting says he has microwaved his dirt before and it worked just fine.
All right.
We have another question about what if you just add boiling water to the dirt? Would that sterilize it?
No, I wouldn't say so, because you're not heating up that soil to a boiling temperature for all of that long. And so the sort of low, slow exposure to heat is what kills those pathogens. And the other thing that can actually increase certain bacterial and fungal growth is the presence of water. And so I don't think that you would necessarily have all of your soil hot enough for long enough. And then with that introduction of extra moisture, that may actually cause you to just have a better environment. Again, that's really, you know, soils is not my area of expertise, but I would just say bake it, microwave it, or buy something like sterilized potting medium from ProMix. Rissy's Greenhouse up here in Fairbanks sells a sterilized potting mix that has some compost in it called Triple R mix. You can also just go to, you know, your local grocer and probably find a seed starting, small bag of seed starting medium. And you can also blend your own mixes to make it yourself. I believe there is a Cooperative Extension publication that talks about mixing, some sphagnum moss or some peat and adding sand to make your own blend, and then how long to bake that for. So there's many ways to get where you need to go for your soil and your seed starting mix. And I hope that answered the question. Are there any follow-ups?
Yeah, well, so Judith put in a link in the chat. So if you haven't opened the chat, at the bottom of your screen, there's a box that says chat. She put in a link to an article on microwaving dirt. We do have one other question. Someone had a question about what did you mean when you said 2 true leaves?
Oh, okay, yeah. So I was going to come back to this, but I tend to jump around when I'm talking. So if my assistant here could look, so all seedlings when they start have cotyledon seeds. And so that is the first leaves. So this is a good example. These are all cotyledon seeds in this pot. And it's the first 2 little leaves. They're often not particularly, they don't often represent what the final, the true leaves of the plant will look like. And so this, with the serrated edges here, that's actually a true leaf of this plant. These are onions, so these are a little bit different. Alums don't necessarily have leaves in the same way that these other plants do. So it's the first 2 leaves you see are almost always the cotyledon seeds, and then you'll see a leaf that pops up looking different, and that's a true leaf. And so these are considered, these seedlings might be, these ones are what I brought as an example of they're almost ready to pot up to transplant. So if I wanted to put these into a bigger pot so that they were ready to put in the garden later, then I might consider transplanting these soon, since they're starting to be a little more sturdy and they have their true leaves and they're looking healthy. Okay. All right. Well, so since you guys do have access to the chat, that was my misunderstanding. I have a few different seeds with me today that I can start. If people are interested in seeing anything in particular, because I won't necessarily do all of these, I have lettuce, cucumber, kale, dill, winter squash, cress, or bush beans. If anyone would like to see, I also think I have Brussels sprouts and some peppers. If there's any of those vegetables that people would like in particular to see how they're transplanted. The basic process is essentially the same for all of them. The biggest difference is whether or not you can see the seed because they're so tiny, and also the depth of planting, which I'll go over in more detail. But if anyone has any like top picks that they'd like to see planted, then throw them in the chat, and Teresa, you can just call them out to me.
Cucumber, dill,
Cucumber, all right. Okay,
squash.
all right. That's great. So this is a cucumber variety that I have not tried before. The other thing that I haven't mentioned yet that I will talk a little bit about at the end of this presentation a little bit more with some slides to give you a better sense of what I'm talking about, but I also direct the vegetable variety trials here at UAF. So what we're doing with that project is evaluating cultivars or varieties that are available to see how they do in Alaska growing climates. So those trials are currently replicated in Fairbanks and down at the Palmer-Matsu Experiment Station. And we're looking to expand that to Southeast Alaska and a site with limited trials up in Anaktuvuk Pass above the Arctic Circle. So some of the varieties I have here to start today are not actually varieties that we trial. So I can't tell you, there's a few, but I can't tell you a ton about how they do. I brought a lot of the trial seed packets that I get when I work with different seed companies. But there will be more information about varieties that we actually recommend for you to grow in your Alaskan garden. And if you have questions about those throughout the presentation, feel free to throw those out and I'll answer them as I go. That being said, we're going to try an American pale green cucumber, which is, to me, looks kind of like, it's long like an English cucumber, but isn't necessarily. And I've never tried it before. So we're going to see what these seeds look like and start them in some of our sterilized potting soil mix, the one that does have some compost and soil, since I won't necessarily plan to transplant these before they go outdoors. And I guess, let's see, I'm going out of order here. But one of the things that you may want to consider, again, in your decision in what size of pot to put your seeds in is how long they'll need to be indoors. So again, coming back to these examples here, these are going to be transplanted into larger cells, more like this, before they go outdoors. But because they have so long in the greenhouse before we're able to put them outdoors at the end of May or early June, you know, we start them en masse like this, A, so they don't take up as much room in our greenhouse, but B, because we know that they don't necessarily need, they're a very small plant, they don't need all of that space the whole time that they are germinating. The same is said for things like this. These are bunching onions. This is what they look like when we transplant them up. So these ones are a couple weeks older than these ones, but you can see how we start them in one big cell and then we separate them into, or excuse me, these are storage onions, not bunching. And then we separate them into cells to get a bit bigger. And we'll probably even transplant these into a slightly larger cell one more time before they make it out into the field or the garden for many of you probably. Okay, so we will start with our cucumbers. Couple rules of thumb. Again, it's good to start with clean hands. So your potting material is clean, your cells are clean. You know, seeds have been growing out in the wild, exposed to all kinds of things for millennia. They can withstand, you know, the natural bacteria and fungi that exist in an environment. This is just sort of good practices to avoid, again, heartache later on if your seeds were to die off unexpectedly. So the other thing that you may want to do, which I've already done, is that I didn't demonstrate, is you can pre-wet your soil. And so this soil that's here is actually out of a much larger bin that we have in the head house. And we actually pour water in that soil and mix it together so that it's slightly moist before we put it into the cells. When I say slightly moist, I mean it feels kind of like you know, a ever so damp sponge. It's not wet. You wouldn't be able to wring out any moisture, but it just has the, you know, it feels damp when you touch it. And that is a good rule of thumb for when you're watering seedlings, is you never want them to be super wet. You never want to be able to wring out water or have it a muddy consistency. You want it to be damp, like a damp sponge is a good rule of thumb. Okay, so here's our cucumber seeds. And a good rule of thumb is to always plant in duplicate or triplicate per cell. And when we plant seeds, we typically want to plant them at a depth that is twice their diameter. So with these cucumber seeds, I basically, I'll be wanting to plant them about an eighth of an inch deep, because you see two seeds next to each other is about an eighth of an inch. So you can use a dibble, which is, I don't have one on me, but it's a fancy word for like a little stake, or you could use a pencil and you can make a hole like this. I often just use my fingers. It totally depends on the seed that I'm planting, and I'll show you maybe with the lettuce or the cress seeds what that looks like when you have a really tiny seed and you just want good soil contact. So we just drop our seeds in and then, you know, we will just lightly, ever so lightly, fill back over those seeds. The other thing that I like to do that I didn't just demonstrate is oftentimes I will make all of my dibble holes and I will put the seeds in before I, put the seeds in, and before I fill them, that way I can see that I've filled those cells and I have a visual on it before I go back and fill those over. And so now you'll have potentially two seeds or two seedlings per cell. And it's a good idea, again, once those true leaves have emerged. So you have the first two leaves that come out are your cotyledon seeds, and then you have a true leaf that will look different and more like, yeah, that's probably pretty hard to see, but that will look like a mature or a small version of a mature cucumber leaf. And that is when you would decide which of the two seedlings, if you have two or three or four seedlings, are the strongest. So healthiest, they, you know, the color looks good, they look robust, they have a nice thick stem, not gone all spindly. And then you would cut the seedling that you want to get rid of. And the reason you cut them out and not pull them out is because you can actually damage the roots of the seedling that's still in the cell. So when you pull it out, if those roots are intermeshed, you can actually like damage those roots. So we recommend that people cut them or pinch them off with your fingernails. Either of those will work. Okay, so I have planted these cells with my cucumber. I'm going to mark it and separate these because it probably won't be the same thing. And I didn't plant these on seed. This is what happens when you get distracted. All right, so again, two seeds per cell, cover them. They're about an eighth of an inch deep. Another reason for keeping your hands clean and dry is if you've brought other seeds out of the package, you can drop them back in there and close that and save them for later use. I can talk a little bit about seed storage later if people have questions related to that. Okay, so I am not gonna do a great job at demonstrating this right now, just because normally I would seed these and then take them into an environment where I could get things wet. But now, after you've put your seeds in, is when you would water them. Or in this case, I'm going to seed up a few other things and then water them all together. And again, I wouldn't necessarily recommend using a watering can like this. I would recommend a wand that has a mist or like a shower setting, or a small watering can. The main thing is you don't want to wash away your seeds, and you also don't want to Again, you want the soil moist. You don't want it to be super wet. So I think what I'll do is I'll seed up a few more things, and then we'll go to the greenhouse and I can kind of demonstrate what that looks like. Okay, so people are also interested in squash and was it dill?
I think people would be interested in seeing a tiny seed.
A tiny seed, okay. Dill's pretty tiny, but not the smallest. So I'm gonna do a cress. So cress is an herb. It's a leafy herb, and it's got, you know, very small, not quite as small as some carrot seeds, but similar in carrot seed size, light brown seeds. So they're harder to see. And what I'll likely do with this cress is do a mass seeding. So we'll have a result like this when they germinate. And later I can come and separate these and transplant them as I've described. So this is our vermiculite soilless potting mixture. And so when you have tiny seeds like this, you don't necessarily need to make a dibble because they don't need to be an 1/8 or, you know, really any depth. Again, this is pre-wetted soil. And so we can get away with just scattering some seeds on the surface. I try and space them out, I guess, in a very general way. I'm just kind of dropping a few seeds every, you know, 1/4 inch. And this just makes my life easier when it's time to go to separate these. I don't know if you can see, but like here's a clump where a bunch have grown together, and those are going to be a lot harder to separate than say these ones that are, again, I don't know if you guys can see this, but these ones that are, you know, an 1/8 of an inch apart or so. So I've now got my seeds in there. And then what I recommend doing is just getting a small handful.
You're welcome to.
And scattering this over the top of these seeds. Some people say you don't even need to cover small seeds like this if you have good soil seed contact, so that those seeds get moist and stay that way. I like to have just, again, the lightest layer covering those seeds, so that I know that there will be some soil to keep those seeds moist on either side of it. And again, I will mark it so I know what to expect, and when to think about transplanting those seeds.
Okay, Glenna, we have a bunch of questions.
All right, let's answer some questions.
So I think you might have answered this at the beginning, but the list, the handouts that you said, what are those handouts? What's in those handouts?
Right, so the first handout you'll see is the seed starting and transplanting publication from Cooperative Extension. And this also contains some other links to publications by Cooperative Extension that'll be helpful. I've also included just some of my talking notes after teaching this workshop over several years. I have just kind of written down many of the topics I cover and just kind of bullet pointed them so people can reference as they're starting seeds, be like, oh shoot, what did she say about how deep to plant a seed? And so just some of those notes are in here. Everything from which kind of soils to choose, sterilizing your pots, to talking about germination and damping off, just reference points for those of you who are joining today. And then, yeah, go ahead.
So there's a question about, is there a list of seed varieties that grow well in various areas of Alaska?
Yeah, and I'll talk more about that at the end when we share that PowerPoint. But yes, we do have a recommended variety list in the Cooperative Extension Publications library. And there's also a link that I think Daryl will share in the chat that will take you directly to the most recent variety trials that we've done here at the UAF and Palmer experiment stations. And so you can follow those links, open up those publications. we do an annual publication, so you can see the results for a specific year, but then also if you're interested in, say, selecting a bean variety, you can look at, everything from 2017 to 2021 and see which of those varieties maybe did the best year after year. But I'll talk more about that, and I can give some specific recommendations if anyone's got questions about those.
Okay, we have another question. If compost is sterilized, doesn't that kill off the microbes that make it valuable?
It does, and you're only sterilizing it for the sake of starting your seeds. So you don't want to sterilize your compost once you're transplanting these up into bigger pots or you're transplanting out in the field. So compost, when we talk about sterilizing compost for the sake of seed starting, it's still got a lot of organic matter. It's still got mineral value in it, and it's still got the macronutrients that plants need to grow. Compost certainly comes with a whole biome of bacteria and fungi and beneficial invertebrates, but we don't necessarily want that in our greenhouse environment, if that answers the question.
Great. So specifically for seeds,
yeah,
and then once it goes outside, regular dirt.
Yes. Yep.
Or
then you're
or
free to put it in your garden soil, in pots, add compost, of course. Like, yes, we want all the good things that are in compost, just not inside the greenhouse and not exposing these pretty delicate little seedlings to it. Again, plants have been growing outdoors, for longer than humans have been around, right? So we've got pretty resilient plants here. This is just general rules of thumb, best practices in a horticultural environment.
Okay, and there's a question about watering.
Mm-hmm.
Many people have talked about when they do their seeds, they just put water in the tray and let it soak up through the dirt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's bottom watering is another good practice, and that's something that I will talk about when we go water these. If you have a tray like this one, which it's going to be kind of hard to show you, but there's no holes in the bottom of this. I got it dirty so you can't see. So you could bottom water in a tray like this. We also use things like this for the sake of moving our trays around. So obviously this wouldn't work for bottom watering. So it depends completely on, what materials you have available to you. The benefit potentially of bottom watering is you're not putting water on your seedlings, and so you're not creating that water-rich environment again, where fungal diseases or pathogens or bacteria could proliferate. And so some people recommend, especially for certain crops that are prone to powdery mildew, botrytis, things like that, that you bottom water. So in our greenhouse, I don't really do that with most things. As some plants get bigger, the other benefit of bottom watering is once these artichokes are about a foot high, which is what they'll get in the greenhouse, and they've got a lot of roots that are down towards the bottom, it's actually beneficial for the plant for it to be able to soak up water from the bottom. So I use it for that reason more so than avoiding getting moisture on the leaves. And part of that is because in our greenhouse we have an automatic spray system just that keeps everything moist. So in my mind, it's a little bit futile to avoid watering over the top, to just have it coming down in a mist anyway. Maybe you have a specific, yeah.
So just one more question. And I just want to mention, if you look in the chat, there's 2 links to the Cooperative Extension publications that you can find. Roxanne asked a question. She grew Mammoth Sunflowers. They got 8 feet tall, but they didn't flower.
Yeah. Without a little more detail, I mean, we could try and troubleshoot that. But the thing about Mammoth Sunflowers is sometimes they're just, I don't know where you're growing them. I don't know in what medium, but sometimes they're just a little too big for our growing season length. They take a little bit more time to mature. So again, this is where variety selection is really critical. And I can talk again a little bit more about that. But for example, there's some dwarf sunflower varieties, which aren't nearly as spectacular as those 10-foot tall ones, right? But they were specifically bred for the Alaskan environment. So they certainly will, you know, flower, they will bloom, they will produce oil seed, and that people have used for bird seed and things like that. But yeah, oftentimes, if you have something that is healthy the whole season, it grows all the way up and it produces, you know, your flower head, and it just doesn't flower before the killing frost, that's often an issue of variety selection.
Great, that's all our questions, so we can move on, and we'll take another break, so keep putting your questions in chat.
Yes, please, thank you. Okay, so I'll do a slightly bigger seed just to show you these. These are a winter squash variety. You can see the seed's much larger. This is about a 1/2 inch by a 1/4 inch seed. Winter squash, typically I wouldn't plant this early. People often make the mistake of, so I'll back up a little bit. Timing is everything with transplants. And I'm demonstrating right now. If you're curious about what to be starting right now, we're about 9 to 10 weeks from the last frost date in Fairbanks, at least. Our safety date is June 1st, and our season now is often last frost is sometime in the end of May. However, this publication does have a list of some of the varieties and how far out you need to start them. So for example, onions 8 to 10 weeks, which is why we have these baby onions here, is because we started them about 2 to 3 weeks ago before the last frost. Things like winter squash, we only want to start 3 to 4 weeks before they go out. And part of that is because they get big really, really fast, and they start sending out their vines, and they get kind of unruly, but they also don't like being transplanted. They'll experience transplant shock if you transplant them too late. So I'm just going to demonstrate this, but I don't encourage anyone to go start winter squash after this presentation. Winter squash is another one of those ones that I'm not going to transplant it before putting it out into the field. So I'm going to use my soil and compost with perlite mixture. You know, when you fill up your containers, people say to leave a 1/2 inch. What I found is with these light fluffy soils, because they compress once they're watered, this will go down about 1 inch. Again, we would want to dibble a couple holes. Winter squash are gonna go about 1 inch deep. So for me, that's right above my first knuckle. And then you would drop them both in, back cover. And I don't tamp or push down on the soil too hard. I give it like a very gentle tap. This is not a pushing of the soil. It's just kind of a tap. Again, that's to increase that soil seed contact. Another, common seed starting practice that I just wanted to share with you guys is soaking seeds. So this is an example of seed stratification that's like pretty straightforward and used for some common crops like beans. So beans and peas, they grow really well in the Alaskan environment. And what all this is you would put some of your bean seeds into a cup and add some water and let those soak for up to 8 hours, up to 12 hours. I usually say about 8. If you leave them too long, what can happen is your seeds will absorb so much moisture that they actually split. So leaving them overnight isn't a great idea. This just helps soften that seed coat and help them germinate better, often because thick seeds, many of you may be familiar with bean seeds, so forgive me if I'm over explaining this, but bean seeds are, they're thick. The cotyledon inside is very dry and thick as well. And so often what happens is you have poor germination in seeds like this, just because it takes so much moisture for them to be able to actually germinate. And if you don't have evenly moist soil, just kind of that Goldilocks evenly moist soil, what will happen is some of these will just stay dormant in the soil and not actually germinate. So we soak them. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up with soaking beans is you can add a mycorrhizal inoculant. So mycorrhizae is, let's see, this is just an example of an inoculant. I'm not necessarily endorsing this brand. There's many out there, and they are in different combinations for different crops. But this helps nitrogen fixing plants like legumes, fix that nitrogen into the soil and make it available for the plants, and also fix some more into your soil. So I'm not going to open this package right now because it's not currently open, but all I would do is make a slurry with this water right before planting these. So the seeds don't need to soak in this for 8 hours. Just right before planting, I would, again, add some of this, make a slurry, and then put it into the garden. Beans do not need to be started indoors. I know some people like to, depending on the variety. Again, if it's got many days to maturity, you might want to start like whole beans inside if you're looking to have a big trellis. But especially for things like bush beans that we would consider like a garden green bean, we really just plant that directly into the garden. So these are being sacrificed in the name of the workshop, but this is what I would do later in the season as I'm getting ready to plant outdoors. Okay.
Glenna,
Yes.
couple questions.
Yes.
Last frost, or when you move plants outside for various regions of Alaska, what is the date?
Well, that's a great question, and what I was going to talk about next. And without a crystal ball, I can't ever tell you the date. There's some general rules of thumb that will help all of us sort of think about when to harden off our plants. So I'll explain that a little bit more in a moment, what hardening off is. But we want to look for the last frost so that it doesn't kill our little tender seedlings. I guess I'll talk about hardening off now. So in order for our plants to be robust enough to grow out in the field, they've been in a nice indoor or greenhouse environment for their whole lives so far. And so we want to harden them off, which is just taking them outside and exposing them to outdoor environments for increasingly longer periods of time, for about a week before we transplant them out. And so up here in Fairbanks, this is something I would start doing in mid-May. We at the Agriculture and Forestry Experiment Station have access to a high tunnel and a low tunnel, which means that we can actually take them outside, expose them, but then bring them into that outdoor greenhouse environment at night, so they're protected. Some people at home, for example, I just take my seeds from inside my south-facing window and I put them outside on the deck for an hour the first day, and then 2 to 3 hours the next day, and then 4 to 5 hours the next, and increasingly building up. If it is windy, if it is extremely sunny, so the suns are getting a lot of radiation, I do it for shorter periods of time. So you kind of have to gauge that based on what's going on with the weather conditions at the time when you're trying to harden those off. So that being said, once the plants are hardened off, they are then ready to plant outdoors in your garden. However, if we aren't past the threat of frost, I would just say keep doing that activity of the hardening off until that threat of frost is really passed. And the only way to know that is to watch your weather forecast. I recommend using NOAA. They are very reliable, and there are weather stations throughout Alaska. Some of the other oh gosh, what are they called? Forecasters, like Weather Underground. They're aggregating the data that often comes from the NOAA stations. But I usually, especially for research purposes, use NOAA. Another app that a lot of people really like is windy.com, and that will actually show you what to expect in terms of the forecast for not only weather but precipitation, or excuse me, temperature, but precipitation and other climatic events going on. And then there is a new tool that was developed by some UAF researchers at the International Arctic Research Center, and it's called the Garden Helper tool. And unfortunately, I didn't include a link to that, but I can find it later if someone is having trouble finding it. But if you type in Garden Helper tool UAF or SNAP UAF, SNAP UAF to Google, you should be able to come up with that. And what's nice about that tool is that it will actually allow you to search by region historical frost dates for both a hard frost and a light frost. So we consider a hard frost anything 30 degrees and lower, and a light frost like really kind of hanging right around that 32 degrees. Some plants are more hardy than others, so that's the other thing you have to take into consideration. Things like your tomatoes or peppers or winter squash, they're really susceptible to frost. However, things like lettuce and kale, peas, they can handle light frost. And that's why you'll see some people even planting some of their direct seed vegetables like peas, like lettuce, like beans. They'll do that before sort of the last frost. Good. And they'll be, they will be, I guess, hardy enough to withstand any low temperatures that they might encounter, assuming there isn't another really hard frost coming down the line. So again, dropping down to that like 30 degrees Fahrenheit or so.
So Glenna, we have a bunch of questions.
Okay, the more I talk, the more
if you can't take your plants in and out all day long, can you put them in the shade or on the north side of your house?
That's a good question. At first, you really, when you're hardening off your plants, I'm assuming that's what this question is referring to.
Yes.
At first, you really want to start with a small period of time. You want an hour, 2 hours max. And so I would recommend starting on your weekend so that you can kind of develop that tolerance. There's some plants that may be fine with that. But you may come home from a day of work after 8 hours and find that all those starts that you've been nurturing along this whole time are limp and fallen over or have broken off at the stem from the wind potentially. Again, if you can start when you have just a couple days to build up that tolerance, that's better. And then if you do have a protected area, I've got a little area on my deck where there's some protection between the wall of the house and the railing of the deck. And if I hang a blanket over that railing, for example, it will just keep the wind from hammering those little plants quite as much. And it'll keep kind of some shade for that area. So yeah, I guess that would be my recommendation.
Okay, next question. I'm going to do rapid fire here.
Yeah, okay.
Are there Alaska seed companies? We used to have Denali Seed Company, but they are no longer in Alaska.
That's right. So Denali is now Best Cool Seeds, and we do have Found Root Seed Company, I believe. And forgive me if I've overlooked another, but Found Root is out of Haines, and currently they're our only Alaska seed company. They do produce some of their seeds, but they also procure seed from other companies outside of the state. So many seed companies, just to give you a little bit of context, many seed companies, they package their seeds. However, they contract other farmers, seed producing farmers, to develop the seed, and then it gets cleaned and sent to the actual seed packaging company, who then tests for germination, treat it with fungicides that might be necessary, and package it and sell it to us, the end consumers. So like any other seed company, Found Root out of Alaska is our current Alaska seed producing company, and they do both.
Okay, next question. I'm gonna jump through it because we're running out of time. What other seeds should you soak besides beans? Nasturtiums?
Yeah, you can soak nasturtiums, definitely corn, beans, peas, legumes typically benefit from being soaked.
Can you talk about,
large seeds. Yeah.
okay, great. Can you talk about indoor lighting for starting seeds?
Yes, and there is a Cooperative Extension publication that's called Managing the Indoor Growing Environment, I believe, that talks more about this, but a south-facing window is typically adequate if you notice that you have very leggy plants. So getting long stemmed and kind of reaching for the light, you might want to consider getting a fluorescent hanging light system. And you want that about 4 inches above your seeds and to keep raising that level as your plants grow.
Okay, and then several people have put things in the chat, links to UAF Cooperative Extension publications, so be sure to check those out. Kathy says she puts her seedlings under an umbrella outside.
Oh,
to
that
keep
could work.
them.
Yeah.
Okay, and someone else said fund root is great.
Yes. Yeah,
So.
found root is doing a lot of really good work. I'll put it shortly that way.
All right.
Okay, so how much time do we have left, Teresa? We
are at 58. So we have like 2 minutes left.
Okay, so I'll pause here. I will just trust that you guys will know that when we talk about watering our seeds, we want to water lightly. You can water multiple times, you just don't want to wash away your soil. So I'm not going to take us into the greenhouse, but I will send, if you guys want to share that PowerPoint screen, or excuse me, the PowerPoint presentation I put together, we can just review that really quickly. It gives an example of some of the varieties. So I was going to set aside a little bit of time to talk about the vegetable variety trials that we do here at the Agriculture and Forestry Experiment Station. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but what is important to know is we trial about, I think we're up to, are they sharing the presentation? No? Okay, we're up to, I think 22 crops in Fairbanks and 8 in Palmer. And around 140 varieties of all those crops. So that's including corn, artichokes, asparagus, winter squash, spinach, hot peppers, beets, carrots, beans, lots of different crops. And so what we're evaluating is of what is commercially available, so the things that you can buy from different seed companies, which of those varieties do best in the Alaskan environment. The reason we do these trials is because obviously it's very important that we have cultivars, that we're selecting cultivars that will actually mature for us. So we have a limited growing season and oftentimes a cooler season, or excuse me, a cooler environment than where many of these specific varieties are bred, and therefore they don't do as well in our climate. So I select seeds from different northern seed breeders and seed companies. So like Johnny's up in Maine, High Mowing in New Hampshire, and there's some seed companies out at like Stokes out of Canada, and starting to work with Found Root to test these varieties that are up here, or that will likely do better up here in Alaska. We have not had a plant geneticist or a plant breeder for about 30 years, which is part of the reason these variety trials have been reinstated, and we hope to keep them, we just got funding to keep them going for another 5 years and hope to keep them going for longer than that. So on those links to the variety trials, you can see again which crops that we've been trialing since 2017. The trials have been growing. So for example, last year was the first year that I tested hot peppers or artichokes in Fairbanks. And we will, I hope, be developing more relationships with other producers throughout the state to replicate more trials in different regions that aren't currently represented in the trials in Fairbanks and Palmer. That being said, if you ever have a question about a variety or looking for more information about, plant selection, crop selection, variety selection, please feel free to give me a shout, either through email is usually the best way to get a hold of me, at least at first, or give a call. I included both those contact information, pieces of contact information in the handout that I shared with Teresa and Daryl. Any last questions before we go?
This is Daryl, and I just want to let everyone know that I did include the links to the resources. Maybe them in the chat. Okay with you? I'd like to just share your email in the chat. Is that all right? Okay.
Yep.
I just went into the chat, so hopefully people will get a chance to take a look at that. And I would also include a follow-up email with the resources, your email, and a link to the recording.
So this is a series of 6 gardening classes. I just put in the link to the website, but next week will be container gardening with Gina from the Cooperative Extension Service. And then the week after that will be growing and cooking with herbs with Heidi Radner. And then garden growing vegetables in Alaska with Steve Brown. Then gardening, love to garden, but aches and pains are getting in the way with Art Nash. So definitely check out the rest of those classes. And we will send you an email tomorrow with all the links, a recording of this event, and the PowerPoint.
Great. Well, thanks so much for inviting me, and I was happy to talk with y'all today.
Thank you so much, Glenna.